Hello and welcome to the Bible for Worship at St. Paul Lutheran Church on this 13th Sunday after Pentecost, when our Gospel reading is written in Matthew's Gospel, chapter 16, verses 13 through 20. Now when Jesus came into the district of Caesarea Philippi, he asked his disciples, "Who do people say that the Son of Man is?" And they said, "Some say John the Baptist, but others Elijah, and still others Jeremiah or one of the prophets." Jesus said to them, "But who do you say that I am?" Simon Peter answered, "You are the Messiah, the Son of the living God." And Jesus answered him, "Blessed are you, Simon, son of Jonah, for flesh and blood has not revealed this to you, but my Father in heaven. And I tell you, you are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church, and the gates of Hades will not prevail against it. I will give you the keys of the kingdom of heaven. And whatever you bind on earth will be bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth will be loosed in heaven." Then Jesus sternly ordered the disciples not to tell anyone that he was the Messiah. The Gospel of the Lord. Thanks be to God. This is a densely packed passage filled with imagery and tradition, much of which is familiar to us throughout church history, and even to some of the more popular awareness that people have of the church. And that's because this passage is about us. Certainly, first and foremost, it's about the us of Matthew's community in the late first century of the Common Era. And perhaps we'll discover it's also about us today. This passage falls in the midst of the section of Matthew's Gospel that runs from chapter 14 through chapter 17 and culminates in Matthew's fourth great speech of Jesus in chapter 18. And the theme of this fourth section of Matthew's Gospel is community. This particular story combines the dynamics of foundation of the community, commissioning of the community's principal leader, and the identity of the community relative to other groups that might be around it. It all builds on this opening question about Jesus' identity. Who do people say that Jesus is? And they come up with some of the great worthies of biblical tradition and also of their own experience. Perhaps Elijah or Jeremiah or one of the prophets, or the recent figure in their own lives, John the Baptist. And when Jesus asks again, "But who do you say that I am?" it's Peter, clearly the leading disciple in Matthew's story, who says, "You are more than anything we have known before. You are the Messiah, the Son of the living God." That identity of Jesus turns the story into the foundation, commissioning, and identity story that it is. Because Jesus moves immediately to speak to Peter by saying, "You are Peter." That's a nickname for Peter. It's really like Jesus saying, "Simon, I'm going to call you Rock or Rocky, because on this rock I will build my community, my church, Matthew says. The only place in the Gospels where the word church is used to describe the community that gathers around Jesus. And that name, Petros, echoes the Petra of the rock. So it's like Jesus nicknames Simon, Simon Rock, because this is the rock on which this church will be built. For Matthew's community, this is clearly looking back to a foundational moment, because Jesus doesn't say, I do build my church, I am built. It's, I will build my church. And that's how Matthew's community says, oh, this is about us. But it's also a commissioning story, because the focus here is on Peter, on rock. And the whole tradition that's pretty familiar in the world about Peter becoming the first pope of the church as the Bishop of Rome emerges from this particular story. Moreover, that commissioning comes very explicitly from God. Jesus says, it is my Father in heaven who has revealed this to you, and not flesh and blood. Elsewhere in the New Testament, in the John community, John 1:13 and 1 John 2:27, the whole notion that it's not from flesh and blood that truth and insight come. Or in the Pauline tradition of Galatians chapter 1, verses 15 and 16, when Paul says, I have a commission that comes from God. I didn't consult with flesh and blood when I was commissioned. It came from God. And so here, what Peter knows that grounds his commissioning as the leader of the community is not revealed to him by flesh and blood, but rather by Jesus' Father, who is in heaven, the one Jesus identifies as the God of Israel, the creator of heaven and earth. And indeed, that then gives this community its identity. Founded on the rock of Peter, who is commissioned as the leader and continuing leading figure of the community, they now know who they are. You see, they are not people of Paul. Paul's communities are identified with Paul as their leading apostle. And perhaps what we see here is something of the tension between the Peter communities and the Paul communities. Because Matthew's gospel, think back to the Sermon on the Mount, not one letter, not one stroke of a letter of the Torah, of the Jewish lifestyle, will pass away until everything is accomplished. Peter's communities look to that Jewish lifestyle as the way that they too will live, understood the way Jesus taught it, understood the way Peter taught it, but clearly focused on the life of the Jesus community, paralleling or echoing or recapitulating the lifestyle of the Torah that has been given to the Jewish people. In Paul, of course, that lifestyle is appropriate for the Jews, no problem with that. God gave it to them and doesn't take it back. But for Gentiles who are now in Christ, there's a different lifestyle. There's a different shape to the way that life is lived, and that is life in the Spirit, life in the gifts of the Spirit. So the identity of this community as followers of Peter, with his emphasis on Torah, and makes it clear that that's who they are, in contrast to the communities of Paul, for whom Torah is not directly appropriate, even though it's respected as correct for the Jewish people. There's another place where this tension between Pauline leadership and Peter leadership emerges in the New Testament, I think, and that's where Paul says that those who don't understand what God is doing in Christ get it wrong because they stumble on the stumbling stone, on the rock of offense. And while that echoes some language from biblical Israel, it's not accidental, I think, that in a contrast, or not exactly competition, but certainly contrast with Peter's leadership, for Paul to say they don't get it because they tripped over the rock. Well, who might that rock be in their own lives? Look at Romans 9, verse 33. And moreover, Paul has said in 1 Corinthians chapter 3, verse 11, that he builds on a solid foundation laid by God, because there is no other foundation on which the church will be built, no other foundation than Christ. And is Paul implicitly here signaling to his community, that Peter group over there that says Peter's the foundation, that's not really quite the way it is? Well, a foundation story, a commissioning story, an identity story, all speaking to Matthew's community about how it is that they understand themselves. It's about us. And it's pretty familiar in our own time too, isn't it? Not because we are Matthew's community. We are a biblical community of the whole New Testament and Old Testament, and have to take all of that into account in the way that Matthew's community would not have. But nevertheless, what Matthew's community is wrestling with here is what we all wrestle with. How do we faithfully live out as God's people what the Bible tells us God has done and keeps doing? What founded us? And where is the ongoing, dependable leadership that we follow? And what identity does that give us in the world? Matthew tells a story to help his community to understand those questions. What stories do we tell about us and the way God blesses and leads us? God bless.